Hi friends, welcome back. This time we are going to be talking about the parable of the prodigal father. Many people have different titles for this parable in Luke 15, but we're going to call it the parable of the prodigal father. What I'm going to do is do a quick overlay of the parable and then give you just a few angles and then actually finish with the personal story if you don't mind. This is titled Living Out the Greatest Parable because a lot of people think that this is, in fact, Jesus' greatest parable. People say that this is one they could preach on their entire lives. There's so much happening in this and so many ways of talking about it because it's really vivid imagery. So if you don't mind, let's do a quick overview. There's the older brother, right? The older brother, what is he? He is strict, right? Then there's the younger brother. And what is he? He's definitely impulsive, right? Impulsive. And let's just talk about them right now. That's why we're using the word brother, because of how they relate. It seems as though in the parable they don't talk to each other. It seems as though the brothers, they don't have much in common. And in fact, it seems as though the older brother is strict in his understanding of how things should be, and the younger brother has no understanding of how things should be. Scientifically, it's because the younger brother, his prefrontal cortex is not developed enough, so he can't comprehend consequences. Then we have the father. And let's use the word prodigal. Prodigal means over the top. It means extravagant. In some senses, it even means wasteful, but wasteful in like an extravagant way of going over the top, trying to celebrate things and people. So here we go. We've got a family, and we've got a problem. Because it's a parable, parables are often, they have metaphor and they allude to other things that are happening. Well, N.T. Wright talks about how these characters kind of symbolize something that's happening in the first century ancient Near Eastern culture. The older brother could be the Jewish people. They're very strict and very much about their laws and rituals and rhythms. And the younger brother, it may seem impulsive, could be the rest of the Gentiles. And then obviously the father could be the God figure in the parable. And so what we have in this parable, Jesus is saying this to the Pharisees, and it's almost intentionally bombastic, but we kind of lose the fact that the gospel is meant for all people, not just the Jewish people. And so how did the Jewish people of their day incorporate the Gentiles? So this parable is actually a grenade more than we realize. It's meant to blow up some frameworks. However, the conventional understanding of it is that Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, and the rest of us are like this down here, that don't be like a Pharisee who values the rules too much. The problem that I have, though, with the conventional understanding of this parable is we tend to sensationalize or overemphasize being the rebellious younger brother, the younger son, and say, just don't be like the Pharisees. But actually, all of us are capable of being both of these. And sometimes you might have heard people say, oh, I had a super wild life, and then I came back and found God. And then you might feel like, oh, I don't have a crazy rebellious story, so what do I do? Does that just assume that I'm this up here? So we've got to think about how we talk about this parable, because my favorite way of understanding it is that this is a map of the spiritual life. This is a journey, a path, that every single one of us have got to become all three characters. And in fact, if you ever have a chance, check out Henry Nouwen's book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. Because every single one of us at some point in our life are this, possibly, but probably also this. And let's be honest, you might start here and go here, you might start here and go here. For all of you young people, some of you might be very strict. And then when you go to college, you might become very impulsive and rebellious. Or there are some of you that are already this way right now, and you're going to bring on rules to yourself because you realize you really need that. But this is not where we're supposed to stay, being strict or impulsive. We're supposed to make the shift to being down here. And in fact, Henry Nouwen says, we can't become a prodigal parent, in some sense of the word, until we know what it's like to be each of these. Because there's a famous painting by Rembrandt that I very much enjoy. And it has the father figure there's like strong lights that are coming down, highlighting the hands as he's blessing the son that's welcome back, the younger brother. And then off to the side, there's the older brother who's angry and he looks dejected, but he also looks confused that the father would welcome the rebellious, younger, impulsive son. Well, Henry Nouwen says the spiritual journey ends, or it reaches its goal, or it finally hits its telos when we assume our own role of being like the Father, even if we're not parents, being like the Father who blesses the wild one home and pleads with the strict one to show grace more and just join the party. What does it take for you and I to not be either of these, but to grow from these and become this? This is what it means to be like God. And in fact, one of my favorite things to do is have conversations with you youth who sometimes you come to the Bible saying that it's archaic and it's behind the times and we shouldn't bother reading it because it's old news. Well, one definition of holiness goes like this. We read the Bible so that we can repeat it, especially stories like this. Holiness takes on the form of repeating this parable in our own lives. Not this part necessarily, but holiness means repeating this part of leaning into being a spiritual mother or father for other people that blesses and pleads with people to join the party. Now that's good news, that's gospel. The story I have to share with you, though, is why I think it's so important to become a spiritual mother or father to other people. There was a series of years where every time I would drive back home to LBI, I would go and visit my parents, and no matter when I pulled in at like 11 p.m., my dad would be sitting there in the living room, and then sometimes he would be like, "Hey, come on in, sit down," and we would talk for like 3 hours sometimes. Other times, if he was sleeping, I'd go around and up the back door so I didn't wake him up, and we would talk in the morning. But this one night, I got in around 11, we talked until about 2 in the morning, and then I was tired. I was like, "Dad, I need to go to sleep." But he was a night owl, so it didn't matter to him. I was like, "I need to go." So I went over to him, and I gave him a hug before going upstairs to go to sleep, and he kissed me on the neck. And I didn't know what to do with that. I remember giving him a hug, and I planted it right here. And I went upstairs, and I couldn't fall asleep for an hour. And I couldn't figure out why. Because there was an intimacy there to it that was really, it jarred me in a good way. And then as I was laying there around 3 in the morning, Luke 15:20 came to mind, where it says that the father saw him far off, ran to him, and then in the King James Version it says that he threw his arms around him and kissed him on the neck. Other translations might word it a little differently. They might say they fell on his neck and kissed him. But it was then that I realized, like, my God, my dad just kissed me on the neck, just like the parable of the prodigal father. And that's what it means to repeat the story of God. That's what holiness is, when we repeat in our very lives the stories that happen in Scripture, at least the good parts. Because all of us have got to lean into this as our own way of being like God. To learn how to love people tenderly, to learn how to bless people when they come home finally, and then how to plead with others. Because to me, the most beautiful sentence in the entire parable, although 15:20 means a lot to me personally, I love the ending when the father goes out to the older son, the older brother, and says, "Don't you know, everything I have is already yours, and I am always with you." What better good news could we have than for God to look at us, even when we're being impulsive and even when we're being too strict on ourselves and others, that God walks out to us, runs to us, and says, "Everything I have is already yours. I am always with you." So this week, sit into that final sentence. Sit into what it means for God to say that to you. And then I plead you to ask yourself, are you this, and once were this? Are you this, and once was that? And what would it take for you to step into becoming a spiritual mother or father to other people? That's all. That's a rhetorical question. That's your homework. So I'm going to add something. I didn't do this last time. But if you're watching this and you've got my phone number, text me your favorite part, all right? You are wonderful, delightful. Thank you for checking this out, and may grace and peace be with you.